Technique selection is usually important when assembling a good fraud monitoring solution, and there are a couple of indicators for a merchant that dictate the techniques to be used for their specific business. Let's take a look. When defining a strategy, the techniques included should not be selected blindly, but based on the fraud risk of the specific retailer or organization. Some techniques, such as address verification, credit card checks, and others are fast and cheap, while others, such as biometric authentication or manual chart reviews, are expensive and time-consuming. So knowing which ones to use is very important. So when selecting the tools to assemble a full strategy, the organization has to select them based on the time and effort involved with each. Organizations can usually be categorized as low, medium, or high risk, and it mostly comes down to two factors, which are the volume of transactions and defensibility of the goods. So for low risk, we have retailers or merchants that have low volume and whose goods have low defensibility or none at all. This includes goods such as clothing, tuition, insurance, and other personal products. They're not easily defensible. People can't sell them for money very easily. Then we have medium risk. These are merchants with medium to high volume and whose goods have medium to high defensibility. They can be sold somewhat easily. Think of toys, games, music, books, clothing, or travel. And finally, we have high risk, which usually comes down to high volume and high defensibility of goods. This is usually the case for electronic downloads, gift cards, adult products, gaming, disposable cell phones, credit lines, or consumer electronics such as computers or smartphones. These levels of risk then define the types of techniques that we should use. There are some that are universal. They should be used at all levels. These include address verification, card security schemes, velocities of use and velocities of change, and consumer identification. These should be used at all three levels. Then specifically for low-risk merchants, you can use, for example, phone and address lookups or email and phone verification. This is what you see when you register for a clothing retailer online. For example, for medium-risk merchants, you should use fraud scoring and rules engines. This is what you will see, for example, in travel portals or high-end clothing stores. And finally, we have high-risk merchants. You should use fraud scoring and rules engines with AI to help the models evolve. You should consider out-of-wallet checks, device identification, or some sort of biometrics. And you can also consider insurance or guarantees. This is used, for example, for online casinos, financial products, or the adult industry. What are some examples of technique considerations? The first is matching costs. Technique selection should be based on the level of risk due to the expected costs. This is why, for low-volume merchants with low defensibility, where there is not going to be a lot of impact due to fraud, the measures can be basic with a low cost. But for high-volume merchants with high defensibility, the impact of fraud will be very high, so costly techniques are justified. The techniques should always depend on the actual expected costs of fraud. In general, automated is always cheaper than manual. Of course, there are exceptions. There are very expensive automated processes, and there are manual processes with people that have a lot of expertise that do things fast. But this is the general rule. Also, make sure that the techniques match. Besides the actual cost of individual techniques, make sure that these are integrated into a unified system. You should have the right techniques, but also combine them the right way. If you have 50 techniques, but they don't share information, they're pretty much useless. The right techniques must combine right. What are our key takeaways here? The first is that there are mostly three groups of risk: low, medium, and high. Technique selection is mostly defined by this. Then, the criteria for defining the risk of those three groups is usually defined by two factors: the volume of the goods and their defensibility, how easily they can be sold. The risk level is merely a factor of one times the other. And finally, it's a balancing act. When assembling techniques, some are going to be more expensive or time-consuming, but they detect more fraud. And it's important to make sure that you balance the time or cost consumed and the quality of protection. So as you see, based on the volume of sales and the defensibility of the goods, will result in a risk parameter, and that risk parameter is usually what dictates the type of techniques that are used at the end of the day.